This is a lecture on post-structuralism. Why is post-structuralist theory sometimes called critical theory? There's two meanings to the words critical theory. One is a more narrow sense of the Frankfurt School, and Walter Benjamin was one of those guys. But what I mean it is more generally. In the larger sense, critical theory is a theory that allows us to examine discourses critically to see whether they're true, to see whether they're immoral, to see whether something needs to be done. That's all. Now, the second part, you will have to describe the postmodern condition using the following 12 terms that I'm taking right off your lesson sheet. You will need to underline the terms as you define each of the terms and use examples to illustrate your points. If you use the same examples that I do, that's okay, but it's just okay. It would be better if you could apply the ideas that I'm giving you to your own examples. Find your own examples. Or use the ones that are in the little green book, the Belson book on post-structuralism. So see if you can adapt these for that. Okay, the underlying idea of post-structuralism is that we feel that we experience reality directly. However, this isn't really true. Instead, we experience reality informed by a forest of signs, by structures which structure our understanding of meaning. And that's why it's called structuralism. Now, the underlying insight comes from linguistics, and linguistics is the scientific study of language, how language is formed, how language is transmitted, what is the nature of language, what is the structure of language, and especially interesting for our purposes is semiotics. Semiotics is a subfield of linguistics that investigates meaning. How is meaning inferred? How is meaning conveyed? And so forth, specifically through language as far as linguistics go. One of the foundational ideas, one of the large insights that we get from linguistics is that when we examine languages that are totally unrelated, let's say, for example, the Japanese language and the Swahili language spoken in East Africa, these two peoples developed language hundreds of years before they even knew each other existed. Yet, all languages independently have the same structure. They all are structured similarly. They have nouns, they have verbs, they have predicates. They vary a little bit in details, but the overall structure is very similar. And this has led scientists to conclude that language is not principally learned, it's innate, as is the structure of language and forms a basis for our understanding of meaning. Now, if we're going to investigate the structure of meaning as it's conveyed in language or in any other system of signification, the irreducible essence is what Saussure calls the sign. The sign. The sign is made up of two parts, the signifier and the signified. The signifier is whatever it is, a word, a gesture, a expression on the face, whatever, that signifies something else. And the signified is what is signified. In other words, if I say that this is my watch, the word watch is the signifier, and this object is the signified. The most important thing to remember is that for almost all signs, the relationship between the signifier and the signified is actually arbitrary. In the vast majority of signs, there is no link between the signifier and the signified. For example, we call this a watch, and in our language, when we speak of a watch, we know what we're talking about. However, in German, it's an Uhr, and Uhr has no meaning in English. So the signifier is kind of free-floating and can take a number of different forms. We could also call this whatever we want to. We could call it a teetotum. And as long as everyone agreed that this was what we were signifying with the word teetotum, we would be able to use it in conversation and in the exchange of ideas. So the relationship between the signifier and the signified is usually arbitrary. It doesn't always seem arbitrary, but they are, and they're culturally bound. For example, the significance of the colors white and black. In our culture, white signifies joy. So people wear white at weddings. Black symbolizes death and misfortune, and so black is worn at funerals. And we kind of take it for granted that white is happy and that black is mournful. However, in traditional Chinese and Japanese culture, it's the opposite. White is worn at funerals, and people would not, in traditional Japanese society, ever wear a white garment for a wedding. Although you could wear a black kimono, and that would be completely, the bride could be dressed in black, and that would be completely acceptable in traditional Japanese society. So the idea that black and white have these fixed meanings, they don't. And also there are clusters of meanings associated with black and white. For example, black means unfortunate in our situation. So we say it was a black day when Napoleon met his end at Waterloo. When the stock market crashed in 1929, we called it Black Tuesday. Devil's food cake is dark. Angel food cake is white. So there are all these associations that are totally arbitrary. Now imagine that if you are black in our culture, and blackness has all these associations with it, most of them negative. Therefore, you have to kind of redefine the negativity of black, right? But remember, those are arbitrary designations. Signs are organized hierarchically into systems. A sign that isn't part of a system has no meaning for the subject. Systems, signs always operate within systems of signification, and these systems of signification are layered one upon each other in very complex sort of conceptual structures. Let's take, for example, very simple sign systems of games, because games, board games and so forth, are very circumscribable rules that are very clear, and that's not always true in society. So, for example, if we take the game of gin rummy, or we take the game of, well, let's take, for example, cards. We can play all the games as long as the structure of the cards remains the same. That is, that there are 4 suits, that there are 3 face cards in each suit, and that there are numbered cards that go from 1, the ace, to 10. As long as this structure is maintained, it doesn't matter what placeholders are put into the structure. So, for example, instead of Jack, Queen, and King, we could have Emperor, Empress, and Prince. And even though we had changed the names, the designations, the structure remained the same. So we could play all the same games. However, if we added 3 or 4 queens so that there were 8 queens or 16 queens rather than 4, it would thereby reduce the value of having a queen because the dynamic structure was altered. And this brings up another point, that every point in a field of discourse is also a position of power and value. So you change the value of the queen by changing structurally how the cards are put together, right? Now, within a circumscribed game, let's say poker, there are certain things you can't do because they have no meaning within the discourse of poker. If I have my 5 cards and I go, gin rummy, right? That doesn't mean anything in poker. It doesn't have any meaning because it's outside of the field of discourse. So a field of discourse is a discursive field. The key word here is discussion. A field of discourse does not always have the same values. People can have very different values, as we can see, for example, in the presidential debates. They're all operating within the field of discourse of conservatism, for example, and on the Republican side, they're always trying to say that I'm the true conservative, I'm more conservative than the other one, but they're all trying to define themselves within the definition of conservatism. Therefore, conservatism is kind of the field of discourse, even though they may have very different views of how to be a conservative or what is true conservatism or what is moral conservatism or whatever. The field of discourse is dynamic and includes many different voices, but nonetheless, if the field of discourse is international politics and then someone brings in something, let's say, about basketball, or the basketball season, or who might win this year, or whatever. That has nothing to do with the discursive field of politics or international diplomacy. So it really wouldn't normally have any position within a discourse that was political, because it's outside of the field of discourse, okay? So what we have are discursive fields that we kind of agree on what are the parameters of it, even though we disagree about specific interpretations of meaning, okay? So we have fields of discourse overlapping other fields of discourse, sometimes in very kind of elaborate structural ways. And so we call this way of looking at systems of signification structuralism, because it looks primarily at the structure by which meaning is inferred or given or deduced or prescribed. Okay? So structuralism as a way of understanding language was then brought into many, many different fields by the mid-century, and especially the social sciences, because a structural view, for example, of anthropology began to look carefully at marriage, who was marriageable and who was not marriageable within a society. These are things that we would investigate. So anthropologists started to look at other foreign cultures structurally. How are they structured? What are the underlying values that structure this society and not others? So in trying to understand another culture, anthropologists would go in and try to deduce what are the deep-lying structures within that field of discourse, and that's called structural anthropology. Those insights can also be applied not only to some other culture, like a Native American culture, but to our own culture. We can begin to think of things structurally, and that's kind of how we've been approaching everything so far this semester. So if we look, for example, at history, which is my field, art history is a type of history, you might think that history is just what happened, but it's really not. A history is based on who tells it, and the person who tells the history is informed by certain assumptions, certain beliefs, certain values of what they think is right and wrong, and these things will structure their understanding. In our in-class review, we plotted a number of facts: the beer hall putsch, the defeat of Germany, the revaluation of currency, the stock market crash, the effects that had on German culture, and so forth, the rise of Nazism, and we plotted out these events that were significant during that period. But we have to remember that as I'm telling those as a liberal professor, I'm implotting them a certain way. By implotting, I mean that history is not what happened. History is a story about what happened. And because it's a story, it also has literary devices, uses devices from fiction. right, from fictional storytelling, such as heroes and villains. And of course, I implot Hitler as a villain, as most of you, I suppose, would. And once you think of him as a villain, then that informs the interpretation of everything else. The beer hall putsch, for example, of 1922, is seen as a foolhardy, ridiculous bunch of drunkards with a lot of bravado. And that's about all it seems. To someone who is sympathetic to Nazi ideology, they would not see that as a silly, drunken uprising, but they would see that as a kind of a heroic gesture of defiance against a Jew-ridden culture. That's how they would implot it. So if you implotted Hitler as a hero rather than as a villain, the whole story changes, because the values that underlie, the facts remain the same. The beer hall putsch, the invasion of Poland, the fall of Paris, all these things are described, but they're understood and given meaning by the particular teller of the story. So that history is not what happened. History is a story about what happened that's implotted using literary-like devices. Now, this same, so that's a structural view of history. So when we hear a history, we can begin to deconstruct it to try to find out the author's underlying values and assumptions. And if we don't agree with those underlying assumptions or values, we're going to have a hard time accepting the logic or the rightness of his interpretation. These same kind of things happen in all different fields. Structural anthropology, we had talked about kinship structuring society, or taboos, what you can or can't do in society. And sometimes there are cross-cultural misunderstandings. The Kwakiutl Indians believe that evil spirits go in straight lines. And when they saw the Christians in a straight line procession behind the altar boy with the crucifix, they jumped to the assumption that this was a demonic religion because it goes in straight lines. Of course, that's because he was applying the structures and meanings that he had duplicated or learned that were just the way things were in his society. He applied those to the other society and he interpreted it wrongly, or he did not understand what they were meaning. Structuralism, besides anthropology and history, structuralism also has influenced the social sciences such as psychology, so that one could see that psychology, that there may be deeply embedded, even unconscious signifiers, like repeating tropes within the discourse that tell you something about yourself and make you interpret reality differently. Let's say, for example, that you had a very bad father, and everything you tried to do as a child, he would say, you're no good, you'll never amount to anything. You know, everything you do is met with that kind of response. Even years later, and your father may even be dead, and you may not even realize it, but those assumptions are still there. Every time you fail something, those words of your father, deeply inscribed in you, say, that's typical, you'll never amount to anything. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, without sometimes the person even realize that they have these assumptions. So the idea in, for example, cognitive psychology or therapy would be to see what are the deep beliefs that are not functional, try to dig those out and replace them with other explanations. For example, to give a concrete example, let's say that you're one of these freshmen that comes into the university, and after the first semester you get your report card back and it's all D's and F's. One way to interpret that would be, I'm a failure, my father's told me I'll never amount to anything. And then you might want to do something different next semester, or you may just quit school altogether feeling like you had failed. You could also use it as information to make you study in a different way that could improve the story. You don't have to jump to the conclusion, I'm stupid, or that college isn't for me. However, there are other ways of structuring that failure and understand it if we can get out of our normal mode of thinking. For example, the student that comes home after their first semester in college that gets all F's and D's, they may say to themselves, this college stuff is not really for me. I'm much better with my hands. And they might decide, therefore, that they weren't a failure or they weren't a bad person. It's just that college, with all its studying and all that sort of stuff, just wasn't their cup of tea, and that they would be much happier as a mechanic, for example. And so that was then a worthwhile thing. They failed some classes in college, but it was an important learning thing because they then found a new direction. So there are many different ways of interpreting any given action, depending on the structures, psychological, the beliefs, the values of what you think are right and wrong that underlie everything. And this brings us, of course, to values. Values are the most important thing in structuring our understanding of people, places, and things. A meta-narrative is a word that Lyotard came up, Francois Lyotard, and we had read his paper on post-structuralism, on the postmodern condition last week in class. And then he defines a meta-narrative as a great overarching narrative that kind of involves other narratives or underlies or limits the dimensions of other narratives and contains within itself smaller narratives. For example, the grand narrative of America, the United States, is this idea of individual freedom. And so it really has conditioned how we think of everything, that everybody is free and should be free. And that meta-narrative underlies a lot of smaller stories of individual strife and conquering of historical examples and so forth. The meta-narratives are deep underlying structural things. And in America, it has to do with personal freedom and the possibility of total human liberation. However, a meta-narrative, let's say, of communism at its height was not a meta-narrative that emphasized individual freedoms, but rather had a mandate for all of society. So that it wasn't so much individual freedom as working together communally and communally owning things instead of being individual. And if those are the values, these communist values of working together, are kind of incompatible with the American values, so that we might dismiss the whole discourse of communism because we disagree with their underlying idea of human nature and of human cooperation and the meaning of society and the meaning of an individual within a society, you see? So that a person raised in one of these cultures just absorbs a whole bunch of assumptions that they might not even have really thought out terribly carefully. In the discourse of Nazism, it was taken for granted that the Jews were this inferior race that really deserves to be exterminated. As long as you hold on to that racist idea, Nazism kind of makes sense. But if you can't agree with that, and I hope you can't agree with that, then the whole thing kind of falls apart as a horrible evil and a terrible mistake. Now, given that there are layers and layers of meaning, structured according to hierarchies of meaning. Ultimately, most of it, of course, being based on the arbitrary nature of the relationship between the signifier and the signified. So we have layers and layers in a very multivalenced kind of structures that we don't even realize are there, but they very much structure how we think about things. By definition, if we change the way we think, if we change our moral attitude, if we abandon certain deep ideas or assumptions and put other ones in their place, we can alter our reality. Because remember, we don't experience reality directly. We always experience it through these structures that structure our understanding. Change the deepest, most fundamental structures, and the whole rest of the structure will reconfigure itself around that. And there are some times that people do have these amazing turnarounds. Think, for example, a famous case of St. Paul, who was an enemy of Christians and actually persecuted Christians. And then he had this vision on the road to Damascus, and it changed his life, and he became super Christian because the values, he didn't see Christianity any longer as a dangerous or a bad idea, but was convinced that instead it was a great idea, it was a good idea, and he wanted to propagate it. And so he also changed fundamentally because some of the deepest assumptions that he had held were replaced by other assumptions. And we can structure our own reality the same way by carefully examining the underlying assumptions and beliefs that we sometimes don't even realize that are in there. And so post-structuralism provides us a means of investigating those things. Well, now that we've talked about how complex the structure is in a culture like American culture in the early 21st century, we do notice that certain structures are deeper structures and other structures are more superficial. Some structures are much more deeply embedded as assumptions in a discourse. And just to take an example from something familiar, in Christianity, there are all these beliefs, of course, but one of the underlying beliefs that you might not think of at first is the idea of original sin. That because Adam ate that fruit and threw us into a state of sin, thereby we need to be redeemed of sin. If you take original sin out of the structure, then Jesus' death becomes problematic because if there's no original sin, how can his death redeem us from original sin? Do you see what I mean? And that's one reason, if Christians are trying to convert a Jew, Jews don't have this idea of original sin. So they would say, saved from what? Right? Because they don't have that underlying assumption going on. So we must realize that everyone has their own kind of assumptions, and I think post-structuralism is very compatible with democracy in that it teaches us to kind of tolerate otherness, to tolerate difference, to see that there is not one way of thinking or one way of doing things, but a multiplicity of different ways of doing things, all of which are based on and structured in those deep underlying assumptions, those deep underlying beliefs. Take those out and the structure crumbles. So what we must seek for are the deepest structures in a discourse, not the superficial structures. Using again the Christian belief, the virginity of Mary is not as deep a structure as original sin. So if we found, for example, that Mary actually conceived in the normal way and actually slept with her husband Joseph, it wouldn't make all of Christianity destabilized. It would be a kind of minor revision that we could come to. In fact, Protestants did actually revise Christianity this way, that they saw Mary as a more ordinary person and not a perpetual virgin, and yet they continued to be Christians. So that was a structure or an idea that was more superficial. It wasn't as deeply inscribed in the discourse as some things. As I said, the deepest structures you may be unaware of. They may be unconscious, and that's why we really need a method, sort of digging them out. Also, when we have a discourse, because binary thinking is so embedded in our Western way of thought, we tend to understand things in terms of the privileged term versus the marginal term in a discourse. Okay, binary oppositions, according to our book. Western culture, Derrida argues, depends on binary oppositions. One term is highly valued, the other found wanting. Nature is privileged over culture in Western discourse, just as speech is privileged at the expense of writing. But these terms can never sustain the antithesis on which they depend. The meaning of each depends on the trace of the other that inhabits its definition. So this binary is a way we have of thinking. So if you look at me, then you say Raverty is overweight. How do we interpret what that means? We usually think in terms of, we'll see imagine a morbidly obese person, and then imagine someone who's very, very underfed, maybe malnutrition even, and we would place Raverty somewhere on that continuum. This does not really reflect the nature of reality, but more of the way our mind apprehends things and judges things. So we can look at a discourse and try to figure out what are the deepest structures and what are the more superficial structures. We can also investigate to find which is the privileged term in a discourse and what is the marginal term in a discourse. For example, when we look at the discourse of gender in our society, which is actually changing quite rapidly over the last 50 or 60 years, maleness and femaleness are indexical differences. If there's any doubt, an examination of the person's body will reveal whether they're male or female. Masculinity and femininity, however, are culturally determined and are labile and are differ from culture to culture, even though they seem like they're intrinsic. And if we would diagram out the ideas in our culture, the received ideas about masculinity and femininity, we would find that all the privileged terms are on the masculine side: strength, intelligence, endurance, and so forth. On the feminine side, in the given discourse, I'm not saying this is how it is, I'm saying this is kind of how it is in our culture, women are seen as weak rather than strong, as dumb rather than smart, and so forth. The good news is, we go right back to the very beginning of the lecture, the relationship between the signifier and the signified are almost always arbitrary. And this is certainly true also of gender. So that a post-structuralist way of looking at gender would be to see it in these binary terms, and then if we're not satisfied, then to begin to overturn them, to begin to show through our actions that there is something that's higher or better or more disciplined in these in masculine, so we can begin to redefine gender for ourselves. We don't have to accept the privilege and the marginalization that are in our traditional culture, and we do see these things slowly changing, and it begins with individual persons. But we do see these things slowly evolving. So that, for example, when I was a boy, sportscasters were always men. It was never questioned. Women didn't go into that field at all, and it was kind of a man's purview. But there's really nothing about sportscasting that is intrinsically a man has to do it. A woman can describe it, can evaluate, they can do everything. And now it's not at all unusual to see a woman sportscaster. However, at one point, that was a role that was just not allowed. Likewise, women priests. Certain Protestant denominations now have women priests, women ministers, in addition to male ministers, although that used to be the rule. So we begin to see that certain highly arbitrary things like gender that have to do with our self-definition, we can rewrite the script. We can see that gender, masculinity, femininity are constructs. They're not something intrinsic, but are constructed. Deconstruction is exactly what we've been doing, to look at a discourse critically and begin to break it down into what are the deep signifiers, what are the more superficial signifiers, what are the privileged terms in the discourse, which are the marginal terms in the discourse. We can deconstruct it so that we can analyze it, so that we can begin to understand whether we agree with it, whether we want to change it, and so forth. And the beginning of it is a realization of that there are structures there that structure our understanding. Now, I said earlier that almost all signs, the vast majority of signs, are arbitrary. You know, there's nothing, an eight-sided sign that we take to mean stop. It does not necessarily mean stop to someone from another culture. However, there are two types of signs that have in which the signifier and the signified are directly linked. And those two types are called indexical signs and iconic signs. Indexical signs, like the index finger, are traces of something. For example, footprints in the snow would be an indexical sign. The smell of smoke indicates always fire. It's indexical. If there's smoke, there's fire. Always. Not just sometimes. Always. Indexical signs are always like that. If I walk across the snow and I have big feet, you can see that it's not some little boy that walked across the snow because his footprints would be smaller. Iconic indexical signs are really, you can't refute them. They're indexical. Also, for example, pointing. If I point at this book, that's an indexical sign. If we go to the back of the book and we look at the index, it will point us to where words like subject, symbolic order, deconstruction, metaphysics, it will tell us what page. It's an indexical sign to the pages. Symptoms of a sick person are indexical signs that are read by the doctor to interpret what's the underlying meaning of it. And sometimes we have symptoms that are similar. Strychnine poisoning has similar symptoms to heart attack. So superficial resemblance is not necessarily mean that it has ultimately the same significance. Iconic signs are signs that are less directly related to the reference than an indexical sign. For example, a drawing of something as opposed to an imprint of something. A drawing of my hand rather than an imprint of my hand would be an iconic sign. Maps are iconic signs, which has conventions. When you move up in the map toward the top of the page, this indicates north. When you move down toward the bottom of the page, this indicates south. Once you know those rules, you can read a map, because a map is an iconic sign of the territory that it represents. And it's not arbitrary, because if it says there's a lake here, there's a lake there. If it says the road turns to the left here, it turns to the left there. There's a direct relationship between the signifier and the signified, but the map is a conventional iconic symbol. All diagrams are iconic symbols. Charts, seating charts, musical notes, right, are conventionalized iconic signs that are meaningless to someone who doesn't read music, but if you read music, they're iconic signs, and they have a relationship to the music. When the pitch goes up in vibrations, the note seems to go up on the staff. When the pitch goes down, the note, the mark, goes down. So there's a direct, iconic, but not a direct relationship as a recording of a piano piece would be an indexical sign, whereas the written representation of the piano piece in musical notation would be an iconic sign. The vast majority, however, of signs are arbitrary, are totally arbitrary. Thereby, we can begin to re-understand and reconfigure our own reality, and therefore our own identity within that reality, by investigating the structures that underlie our beliefs and our deeply held convictions and our morality. If we can begin to deconstruct them and use post-structuralism as a critical tool, we can then investigate the truth and the morality of various claims that are made by different people over a wide range of subjects. So it's clear here that post-structuralism is not merely an art theory, not at all. It's a multi-disciplinary revolution in how we begin to think of ourselves to think of society, to think of what things ultimately mean. And therefore, I think it's a very useful tool to begin to analyze and interpret the world around us, including changing that world, including ourselves becoming not only the subject but the agents of change by reconfiguring our understanding and our assumptions, and therefore the whole structure that surrounds our beliefs, our morality, and our sense of self. Okay, that's about it.